Well, it's coming up to Halloween, you know what that means? It's time to check out an obscure survival horror game on the PS1. When it comes to choice, the PlayStation's library certainly has a lot of options, but I wanted to play something I had never tried before, and also something that could tick all the right boxes. Japanese developed game? Check. PAL exclusive in the West? Check. Polarizing review scores? Check. Very expensive to buy online? Check. Terrible voice acting?
Rick, you okay?
Larry?
Yeah, I guess I'm alive. Where's Jake? Is he with you?
No.
Check. I think we found our game. Chaos Break was developed by famed arcade developer Taito, you know, the Space Invader people, and was released exclusively on the PlayStation in both Japan and Europe in the year 2000. You might notice it says episode from Chaos Heat below the title, and that's because this was actually a successor to an earlier arcade exclusive from Taito called Chaos Heat. So what we're playing today is pretty much an obscure survival horror follow-up to an even more obscure arcade shoot-'em-up, and yes, that is quite an unusual transition for a series. With Chaos Break, Taito set out to make a traditional survival horror experience in the vein of games like Resident Evil or Dino Crisis. You'll explore non-linear levels, look for clues, solve puzzles, scavenge for items, read through notes for backstory if you like. It all sounds very familiar. Only in this game you happen to be very heavily armed, and you can punch the head off enemies, and you can front flip everywhere, if you like. So yeah, Chaos Break isn't really your average survival horror game. Well, it is, it's just they added arcade shoot-'em-up action as this game's big feature. And while it's not unusual to see horror spliced in with sillier, more tongue-in-cheek action like House of the Dead, Zombies Revenge, or even this game's predecessor, Chaos Heat, it is a really odd choice to create a game that's aiming to achieve a genuinely spooky atmosphere, but that also lets you roundhouse a giant rat. Well, at least it was until Resident Evil 4 came along, but you know what I mean. So when you start the game, you get to choose from two playable characters, Anime Jill Valentine, also known as Mitsuki, or Anime Chris Redfield, also known as Rick Ryder, a name reserved only for S-tier chads. Which character you select doesn't really matter too much. There's some unique aspects to each character's gameplay and the routes that they'll take, but 95% of this game will be the same no matter which character you choose. What might sway you in one direction or another though, is the game's voice acting, and it's all you could ever want from a PS1 survival horror title.
Thanks. This is plenty. Hey, take it easy.
Yes.
So you could go for Mitsuki, whose voice acting is pretty bad.
What do you think?
Looks like first stage parasitic infestation.
Or you could go for Rick Ryder, whose voice actor is putting out the performance of a lifetime.
Larry, be careful.
Yeah, I know, but... Huh?
What is it?
There's a busted case. What the...
Larry, I'm coming. Tell me where you are. Larry!
Whoever you pick though, the story is pretty much the same. You're part of a task force called the DEF, which in spite of playing through the game multiple times and reading the manual, I've never discovered what that is an abbreviation for. Anyway, you're basically a military task force that gets sent in to clean up whenever weird experiments have gone wrong. And when a research facility owned by the possibly not evil but definitely evil Fluxus Corporation starts giving off some wacky thermal reactions, well, it's up to you and your pals, fellow DEF agents Larry and Jake, to go investigate. Although don't get too attached to them, because if you're playing as Mitsuki, Jake gets killed off about 5 minutes into the game, or if you're playing as Rick, Larry gets killed off 5 minutes into the game. Don't worry though, they are basically the exact same character, although I still had a hard time getting over Larry's death.
Larry!
So this giant island research facility is our setting, and the first thing you'll notice immediately when starting the game is the character's movement. I was fully expecting this game to have tank controls, but nope, movement here is actually really responsive and smooth. The game also uses fully 3D environments with no fixed camera angles either, instead opting for a dynamic camera which aims to be a bit more cinematic I guess, but half the time it just ends up pointing the opposite direction of where the action is, You can quickly snap it to the direction that you're facing by pressing R1. It's not the worst camera you'll ever come across, but it is less than ideal. The facility is pretty much empty at this stage, but in case you didn't notice the giant parasite worm killing poor Jeff or Larry earlier, the place also seems to have a pretty bad parasite infestation. Yeah, so this game's enemies come in one of 3 flavors. You've got alien parasites, humans and animals that have been infected by the parasites, or the facility's security bots which have been installed to destroy the parasites, and are instead attacking me. If the IT team weren't all parasites by now, I'd say they'd be getting sacked. You've got a few choices when it comes to combat. Each character gets a different main weapon. Masuki gets these cool dual gun tonfas, and Rick gets something called an E-launcher. I don't know what it is, but it shoots big lasers, so that's cool. There's some minor differences to these weapons for each character, but they mostly function exactly the same. A reliable rapid-fire weapon that will be your workhorse throughout the game. There's also a variety of sub-ammo that you can equip to your weapons as well. These are pretty limited, but they give you access to things like napalm, rockets, electric and gas shots, more rockets. They're all pretty effective, but you'll want to save these for the bigger threats throughout the game. And lastly, if you're low on ammo or just want to flex on your enemies, you can just straight up combo them like it's a beat 'em up. This caught me off guard pretty early because at the beginning of the game you can just waltz straight into a room and just batter everything in there using melee if you like. This isn't anywhere near as effective on the game's stronger enemies, but since you've got access to a dodge button, you can probably just dodge your way around any enemy and just kick the bollocks off them if you practice hard enough. At odds with this flashy arcade combat though is the rest of the game, which is really just your by the numbers survival horror. You'll spend a lot of time running around the facility searching every room for items, keys, clues, etc. until you eventually find the room that allows you to progress further. The goal here is to progress down the levels of the research facility, starting with the first floor, with your goal being to reach the 5th floor. Of course, this is all blocked off by a series of enemies, puzzles to solve, and keys to find. The whole game's look and vibe gives off this kind of cross between the environments of the first Dino Crisis mixed in with The Thing, which sounds really cool on paper, but this research facility is seriously lacking in variety. It doesn't really matter what level you're on, what room you're in, the vast majority of the locations in this game look visually identical from one another. This makes exploring the place and remembering where you are a lot harder than it really needs to be, since there's very few key visual identifiers or landmarks to help you figure out where you are. I think the devs understood this though, since you have a full map available to you at any time that both shows what room you visited and where on the map you should go next. But at the same time, that kinda makes exploration quite trivial outside of searching for extra items or collectibles. You'll also come across plenty of terminals, some of which allow you to save your game and the others are used for solving puzzles or unlocking doors. You can also read some of the emails here from employees to help give you backstory on what happened, and not only are the translations on these really rough, I'd say about 80% of the emails are people complaining about giant rats non-stop, and there's so many of them. These people are really concerned by the rats, and I mean, they weren't wrong. I'd be sending a stern email too if I came across these on the job. Speaking of giant rats, the enemies in this game, I genuinely don't know if this game is meant to be scary or piss take, but like, you know the way survival horror games introduce their enemies in a few different ways? Sometimes it's a cutscene with scary music, or maybe they'll give you a slight glimpse or audio cues to build the tension for a jump scare or reveal. Well, Chaos Break introduces most of them like this. It's just a little cutscene, no music, no sound effects. They kind of just wander onto the screen and look really dumb. Between the really nonchalant ways these enemies get introduced and the way you just riddle them with bullets and kick them in the head after they appear, you never really fear the enemies in this game. I mean, some of the designs look kind of cool, I guess, but I still think most of them just kind of look funny rather than scary. That's not to say the enemies aren't tough though. The game does get progressively more stingy with ammo and sub-weapons throughout the game, and the enemies get progressively stronger, faster and tougher. You won't find yourself getting scared, but with some of the scenarios you'll face later in the game with practically no ammo, there's still that familiar sense of survival horror dread where you've barely any supplies and you don't know what's coming around the next corner. As for puzzles, there's really nothing to write home about here. None of them are particularly difficult. You'll repeat quite a few of them throughout the campaign, and I swear they ran out of ideas because some of the puzzles are actually just crosswords or Sudokus, which means they're good puzzles, but it's still odd going from blasting parasites with lasers to like doing a Sudoku, you know? Probably the coolest part of the game are these special events, like where you get to do an autopsy on an alien parasite that's surprisingly in-depth and controls really well. I could probably play a whole game based around alien autopsies if I'm being honest. Beforehand, you've got to actually carry the parasite in its tank towards the lab past loads of enemies, and this part is genuinely pretty tense since you can't fire while holding it, and enemies can also destroy the parasite if they attack it, so you gotta be really careful here. There's also this time section where you've got to mix some drugs and get back in time to inject them into a scientist, and this genuinely might be one of the strictest time sections I've ever seen in a video game. Getting to the mixing station and dodging the enemies along the way is one thing, but to actually mix the drugs, you gotta play this minigame and you have to hit a button when this dot is in the center of the screen, and this is so hard, and you've got to do it 5 times with increasing difficulty, and every time you miss it wastes about 10 seconds. I'd say this part made a few players just rage quit with how tough it is, but making it back to the lab with a couple of seconds to spare, it's some rush. Moving on from the gameplay, the game's presentation is it's a bit rough. We've already talked about how the environments themselves lack a lot of variety, but graphically the game just looks really janky a lot of the time. Performance is generally okay, but there's tons of texture warping, clipping, jaggies, just a real lack of polish all across the game. There are times where I think the character models can look pretty good, but if you enter into a cutscene, you'll immediately start to see all the rough edges come true. The game's music is also all over the place. Sometimes you'll get some cool tracks in certain scenes, and other times the music is almost laughably bad. Most of the time you'll just hear ambient drones or machines running in the background to give a sense of atmosphere, I suppose, but none of it is really that impressive or memorable, to be honest. It's just kinda there. At least the game's voice acting is its saving grace, well exceeding the entry point into so bad it's good territory. I looked forward to every single cutscene this game had to offer, and I was never disappointed. The story unfortunately really feels like a non-factor in the game though. It's nothing you haven't seen before. Get into a facility, rescue 1 or 2 people, one of them is revealed to be the bad guy, destroy the root of the problem, escape in the nick of time. You've probably played and seen it all before. I tried reading through the in-game emails to find out any extra information, but most of it is really badly translated, like I said, and 80% of it is still about giant rats, so outside of a few early hints and reveals, they don't really add too much to the story, nor are any of these actually mandatory for puzzles or anything else, so you could pretty much just skip them if you like. Now the ending can change depending on your performance in some of those events that we mentioned earlier. Usually it just means that you let this side character die or not, but hey, it adds a little bit of replayability at least. So the game kinda just goes through the motions for a little while. Solve a puzzle, shoot some parasites, protect a friendly ally, shoot some more parasites, solve a puzzle, until suddenly you're at the end of the game and you're fighting the last boss, which also disappointingly happens to be one of the game's only bosses. I mean, it's a fine boss fight. I saved all my special weapons for here, so it wasn't really too hard to get by. And then once you're done with that, it wouldn't be a survival horror game without a timed escape sequence, in which I realised that I had incredibly powerful rockets that insta-killed most enemies, that I completely forgot about for the majority of the game. That was pretty dumb of me. After one last run through the facility, you make it out and that's the game. It will take you a little under 2 hours on your first run and probably closer to 45 minutes to an hour on your second run. And it was, yeah, it was fine. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a fun time playing through this, but the game really does feel like this half-baked meshing of arcade action and survival horror, and it doesn't really do either genre any justice. The survival horror aspects are very basic, from the puzzles, basic inventory management, the exploration. Nothing about it is very exciting. It all functions fine, but it's stuff that you've seen done much better in countless other games. And while combat is admittedly quite fun, I mean, shooting big lasers and taking out parasites in hand-to-hand combat will always have its charm, it still ends up feeling a bit too basic and repetitive. The weapon variety is really limited. You'll use one weapon for 90% of the game, and the only thing you can upgrade is the amount of ammo that you can hold in a single clip. So weapons are cool, but they often feel like they should be stronger considering how limited they are throughout the game. Except for those insta-kill missiles. They're very cool. And even though I really like how arcadey and over the top it is, it just really clashes with any of the horror elements that they're trying to pull off. I really wish they would have just gone all out in one direction or another, refine the survival horror elements and focus on making a genuinely scary game, or just ditch that part and go full on the arcadey horror action. It made me curious enough to actually play this game's arcade predecessor, Chaos Heat, and after struggling to get it running on MAME for a little while, I eventually got it up and going, and I played through that game a few times, and even though it's only a 45-minute arcade game, the whole thing just ends up being a much better game in the end. Chaos Heat is a pure arcade top-down run and gun, and it's more or less the exact same game as Chaos Break, just played in a completely different style. The characters are the same, the weapons are the same, a lot of the music is the same, and it makes me realise that most of the assets in Chaos Break are actually just taken directly from this game. Only in this game there's just way more variety in monster designs, there's tons of bosses, and some of them genuinely look really cool and creepy. You can really see the Thing inspiration in this game, even the giant rats make an appearance, and they're even bigger. Interestingly, Chaos Heat also includes a third playable character called Voot, who is a German ninja with a flamethrower, and he is completely absent from Chaos Break, which is a damn shame. Genuinely, I preferred this game a lot more. The setting and enemies work a lot better in this style, and it ends up being a really fun horror-themed arcade shooter. I'm disappointed that it never made its way out of the arcades. This definitely feels like a title that would have fit right at home on the Dreamcast or something, with a few extra features and modes added on. So, is Chaos Break worth playing? I had fun with it. I don't think it's a particularly good game. It's pretty rough on the presentation side. The survival horror and action gameplay is fine, but comes off a bit half-baked and doesn't always mesh that well together. Plus, the island facility is just kind of a drag to get around. But it's still got plenty of fun moments, some genuinely tense sections, really dumb looking enemies, big guns, anime Jill Valentine, a guy named Rick Ryder, and some of the best worst voice acting you'll ever hear on the console.
Experiments in fusing humans with the parasites? Huh?
So, if that seems like your kind of thing, definitely give it a try. You could certainly do a lot worse. Just, maybe don't spend 100 quid on it. You could spend that on Klonoa instead, or 100 hamburgers from McDonald's. Whatever floats your boat.